Hello everyone, welcome back. Hopefully my face is a little bit familiar by now. Now, as I said before, I don't plan on stopping uploading every day. Now, going forward though, all the videos will be posted on this channel. I don't know if the other channel will be reinstated with YouTube, meaning like if I'll be able to get monetized again. I did a pill, there's no guarantee that I will. They haven't got back with me. It could take up to 2 weeks, like I said in another video. And with that being said, I didn't want to just stop uploading. If anything, YouTube lit a fire under my ass, and I literally want to upload twice as much as a fuck you to YouTube. Now, going forward though, I did have to make major changes to my editing style because I guess YouTube thought it was too redundant. So we had to bring a new companion to the channel, which you'll see. Now, hopefully y'all do enjoy it. And I guess my last words, thank you all for support, for sticking with me, and hopefully, we could weather the storm together and get through this. As always, thank you.
In the grim darkness of the far future, the wound in the heavens does not heal. The eye of terror gapes in the night like a ragged god wound, a vast cataract of unreality where the sea of souls spills into real space in ceaseless storms. Around its burning rim, entire sectors have been spent like ammunition. Fortress worlds have been razed and ruined and razed again upon their own bones. Armies beyond counting have marched into its shadow and been forgotten, their banners ground into the dust alongside those of traitor legions and alien hosts. Black crusades have crashed out of that horror again and again, each one a hammer blow of war fleets and damned champions, each one beaten back only by the sacrifice of worlds. The ledger of those wars is not marked in victories and defeats. It is marked in dead suns and quieted vox beacons, in the silence where whole populations once prayed. The High Lords of Terror read those ledgers. They listened to grim reports from Cadian generals whose worlds were cracked but unbroken, and from Void commanders whose fleets massed and died along the unstable routes of the Cadian Gate. They studied the bewildering skein of warp storms and the inexhaustible madness beyond. They knew that the foe would come again and again after that, until either the Imperium or sanity itself was spent. Walls alone would not hold, regiments alone would not suffice. The chains upon the eye had to be forged of gene-wrought steel and unbending obedience. Thus were the Astartes' praises conceived, chapters not destined for glorious crusades into distant stars, but sentenced instead to a single endless vigil. They would encircle the eye at distance, their fortress monasteries and watch fleets, a ring of blades eternally turned inward. They would stand where the Imperium was rotten, but not yet broken, where a moment's weakness might open the way to terror itself. Among these jailers of the abyss were forged the Subjugators. Their birth is written in half-truth and misdirection, inked in over by cautious hands and disputed by those whose duty it is to know such things. Some archivists will swear the Subjugators descend from the so-called 23rd founding, shaped in the aftermath of earlier Black Crusades, when fresh Astartes blood was poured into the Cadian Gate like so much oil onto a fire. Others insist upon the 24th, placing their genesis even later, in an age when the Imperium no longer even pretended that peace might be reclaimed. The Subjugators themselves do not care. Dates are for scribes and cowards. They know only that they were born into a galaxy already collapsing under the weight of war, and that their first breath as a chapter was taken in the reek of burning worlds. From the first, one truth was engraved into their gene-coded inheritance. Their sire is Rogel Dawn. They are sons of the Imperial Fists, scions of that stern Primarch, whose answer to failure was to carve regret into his own flesh. From Dawn they inherited the instincts of the Siege Master, the patience to grind down a foe stone by stone, the refusal to yield even when retreat would be tactically prudent. From his gene line they gained the hard, cold loyalty that does not bend even under the whispers of the warp. But for all that, the Subjugators are not like their brother chapters. Where the Crimson Fists learned caution, and the more measured successors of Dawn tempered zeal with consideration for the long war, the Subjugators' nature was twisted another way by the age that birthed them. They were not raised in the wake of victory to police a recovering realm. They came into being in the late 41st millennium, when the Imperium was already a battered giant held together by habit and cruelty. Every message that reached their nascent fortress spoke of revolts, of Xeno's incursions, of resurgent heresies thought long dead. There was no model of mercy left to emulate, no patient reconstruction to observe. Where their brothers saw defense, they saw only punishment delayed. The home granted to them was proof of the High Lord's intent. The Subjugators were anchored to Xenax, a world in the segmentum solar set, like a bastion at the approaches of holy terror. Xenax is a fortress planet of stone and adamant, its crust pierced by bastion spires and void shield pylons, its surface wrapped in rings of trenches and armored rail lines. Oceans have been drained to make way for armored proving fields and orbital dockyards. Continents have been carved into fire lanes. From Xenax, the chapter's fleets range outward in harsh cycles. Strike cruisers and battle barges sweep between their homeworld, the Cadian Gate, and the troubled marches that lie between the Eye and Terror. Their presence is a rumor of salvation on some worlds and a whispered threat on others. When their sigil appears on a void long-range auger, it means that someone in the labyrinthine lives of the Imperium has decided that a price must be paid in full. Within the fortress monastery that crowns Xenax, the new Gene Sons of Dawn are broken down and rebuilt in a fashion as merciless as the wars for which they are forged. Neophytes are taken from the harshest stock the fortress world can provide, from hive militias that have never known a day without drill or bombardment, from feral tribes who dwell in the shadow of old fortifications, from the sons of officers who understand that service means death. Early indoctrination within the Subjugators is not concerned with honor as other chapters might define it. Their catechisms do not speak of noble sacrifice to protect the helpless. Their oaths dwell instead upon compliance, upon obedience, upon the indisputable fact that a world that harbors rebellion forfeits its right to exist. Where other chaplains might speak of redeeming the lost, the Subjugators' spiritual guardians speak of subjugation and annihilation. Mercy is named a vector of corruption. Compromise is called treason by another name. Any plea for lenience is a potential whisper from the enemy. Those who do not internalize this litany do not survive to bear the yellow and black of the chapter. Failure in the hypnovaults leads not to reassignment to lesser arms, but to a silent execution and the efficient reclamation of organs. The Subjugators will not seed the Imperium with men who might ever question the necessity of breaking a world to save it. In theory, they are as Codex compliant as any Son of Dawn. The chapter maintains the regulation number of companies. Reserve formations exist upon parchment and within versified organizational cant. Veterans are gathered into a first company, armored in the finest suits of tactical dreadnought plate. Tactical, assault, and devastator squads are arrayed as the holy tome of Guilliman demands. In practice, the Codex is treated as a weapon, not a scripture. On campaign, the Subjugators show little interest in delicate strikes or drawn-out counter-insurrections. While other Imperial Fist's successors pride themselves upon measured application of force, the Subjugators' strategoi default to overwhelming planetary assault. They prefer to break the spine of a war in a single campaign season, even if that means grinding cities into powder and poisoning entire continents. This divergence becomes apparent from their earliest recorded deployments. Where the Crimson Fists might secure a bridgehead, stabilize a war zone, and hand command back to Imperial Guard generals to finish the work, the Subjugators habitually prosecute their campaigns to the absolute end. Enemy strongholds are not taken and occupied. They are taken and demolished. Civilian populations that sheltered traitors or Xenos are not spared. They are herded and examined for signs of contamination, then culled in their tens of thousands, if any are found wanting. In this ruthless calculus, they come to resemble not their own gene brothers, but the hated Iron Warriors, loyal only in name. The Iron Warriors tear down walls in the name of chaos. The Subjugators raise them in the name of terror, then bury their enemies under the rubble just the same. Both have little interest in the niceties of collateral damage. The only meaningful distinction is that the Subjugators still bow their helms toward the Golden Throne. Their zeal finds a distant kinship with the Black Templars, another furious scion line of Dawn. Like the Templars, they despise the Xenos and the heretic with a burning fervor. Like them, they see compromise with witch and alien as a stain upon the soul of mankind. Yet where the Black Templars are unleashed on unending crusade, allowed to chase their hatred across the stars, the Subjugators are chained to their appointed regions. They are a guard hound forced to sit, watching the horizon darken, waiting for the moment of impact. This enforced watchfulness breeds an ugly hunger. When war finally comes, it is not greeted with prayers for swift resolution. It is greeted with a bared, bloody grin. All the frustration of long, quiet years is vented in thunder and flame. Administratum reports from those first campaigns are couched in careful, anodyne language, but the pattern can be read between the lines. Hive world rebellions are recorded as successfully pacified, rebel commanders slain, key manufactoria secured. Then come the addenda, the requisitions for mass grave servitors, the request to reroute shipping lanes away from worlds whose populations have been reduced to a fraction of their original tithe capacity. On one mining world, declared secessionist after refusing to meet its quotas and allowing Xeno smugglers to shelter in its outer hab rings, the Subjugators deploy a mere company. Within a standard month, the rebellion is broken. The Xenos raiders are hunted through the tunnels and torn apart in flame-lit caverns. The planetary governor's palace lies in ruins. So too do half the primary population hives, their upper levels slagged by measured orbital barrages that intentionally overrange into districts known to harbour sympathizers. In the aftermath, a single line in a sector ledger notes that the world's tithe grade must be adjusted downward for several generations until populations recover. No mention is made of the children buried with their parents among the glassed foundations of what were once cities. Commanders learn quickly what it means to call for the Subjugators. The chapter does what it is asked to do, without hesitation and without weeping. It wins wars, it closes breaches, it executes compliance in full. But it does so with an indifference to the survival of Imperial populations that chills even those hardened by long service among the stars. Still, when the eye flares, when cults rise in their billions and traitor warbands pour out of long dormant bastions, the sector lords send for Xenax. Better a broken world that still bears the Aquila than a whole world remade in the image of the dark gods. Within the fortress monastery, on a parade ground drowned in the glare of lumen towers and the roar of distant artillery drills, a single figure kneels. The neophyte is bareheaded, scalp shaven, skin marked with the fading lines of surgical scars. The last of the gene seed has settled in his flesh. His bones have thickened. His blood runs colder now, thick with the gifts of dawn. The air tastes of promethium and stone dust. Around him stand the serried ranks of his new brothers, armor the color of beaten brass and ochre, marked with hazard chevrons and the sigil of a mailed fist closing about a broken world. Before him looms a chaplain in black ceramite, skull helm glaring down, Crozius planted upon the cracked ferrocrete. The chaplain's voice grinds through the vox amplifiers like stones being crushed. "Repeat the oath," the skull-faced priest intones. The neophyte speaks, his voice raw, each word driven into him by years of hypno-indoctrination and pain. "I am the chain around the eye. I am the jailer at the gate. The lines come one after another, each a link in a chain that will bind him for the rest of his life. I shall know no compromise. I shall show no mercy. Where rebellion takes root, I shall burn the soil. Where heresy flowers, I shall salt the earth. He tastes blood on his tongue where he has bitten down too hard. He does not falter. Worlds are not sacred, he says. Only the will of the emperor is sacred. Populations are not precious. Only obedience is precious. His gaze lifts, drawn to the distant sky where void shields shimmer faintly against the light of a cold sun. Somewhere beyond that pale glare, the eye of terror writhes and watches. I subjugate the enemies of man, he says. I subjugate the worlds that harbor them. I subjugate my flesh, my will, my life, to dawn and to the golden throne. The chaplain's Crozius flares. The assembled subjugators slam gauntlets to breastplates, a thunder of ceramite on ceramite that echoes like gunfire. In that moment, the neophyte ceases to be merely a survivor of trials. He becomes what the chapter has made him, another link in the chain around the wound in the stars, another son of dawn who will gladly break a world to keep the darkness at bay. The Ebonian subsector had once been a dull entry in the endless ledgers of the administratum, a polite nothing of middling hive worlds and compliant agrispheres, sitting in the lee of more important wars. Its worlds tithed when they could, grumbled when they could not, and were ignored by all but their own petty governors. Then the eye of terror flared, and its shadow reached even there. It began with whispers carried on astropathic currents, unauthorized warp traffic, contact with prescribed cult texts, ships that translated from the immaterium with their crews chanting in strange tongues. A regiment from Abon Secundus returned from a distant war zone bearing trophies that bled under starlight and would not stop. A pilgrim fleet gone astray sought shelter in the subsector and brought with it songs of impossible saints. One by one, the reports reached the Ordo Hereticus. Inquisitor Hallan Gentz was not a man who believed in isolated incidents. He read the thin scrolls of incident, cross-referenced the names of freighters, troop ships and pilgrims, and saw the pattern. The Ebonian worlds had not merely been touched by heresy, they had embraced it. The infection had passed beyond the stage where careful surgery might save the limb. From his black ship in high anchor above the primary world, Gentz watched the light of the system's star guttering through the stained glass of his strategium and weighed the fate of billions against a single principle. Heresy must be burned out, not reasoned with. He spoke the words that would crush the subsector. By his writ, sealed with the sigil of the Inquisition and the seal of the Ordo Hereticus, the Ebonian cluster was declared Diabolos Inculcatus. The phrase was older than most worlds, a relic of the earliest purges of mankind's realm. It meant that the very soil was considered tainted, the air suspect, the seas unclean. It meant that every man, woman, and child drawing breath beneath the light of that star was, in theory and in law, contaminated. It meant that the Imperium had given itself permission to kill them all. The declaration spread through the apparatus of the Imperium like a slow detonation. Vox traffic surged. Astropathic choirs screamed as they projected the Inquisitor's will across the Gulf. Segmentum commanders dusted off bulk deployment plans that had not been needed in centuries. Monitorum scribes began their mechanical arithmetic, moving whole regiments from one line of parchment to another, consigning millions of men to new war zones with the scratch of a quill. The crusade that gathered in the void beyond Abon Primus was vast, even by the standards of that age. Imperial guard armies translated in system and took up station, their troop ships and mass conveyors layering orbits in skeins of steel and rust. Planetary defense forces from neighboring sectors were press-ganged into the forming armada, their officers bewildered to find themselves serving under strangers' banners. Great warships bearing the sigils of the Navis Imperialis arrived in steady procession, macro-cannon batteries still blackened from other wars. They were not alone. Astartes' strike cruisers and battle barges cut through the fleet, like sharks threading schools of lesser fish. The red sigil of the Red Hunters, with its inquisitorial stylings, glared from one armored prow. Another vessel bore the colors of the war-bearers, their own history wrapped tight in secrecy. And there, broad and brutal, the brass and ochre plate of a subjugator's battle barge swallowed the starlight. Cathedral-hulled transports arrived under the protection of these void predators, bearing orders, militant of the Adepta Sororitas. The blue robe and the black sepulchre journeyed armed and armored, their sisters singing battle hymns as they checked bolter magazines and flame projector seals. Whole convents uprooted themselves at the Inquisitor's summons, each one a weapon of faith, ready to be driven into the rotting heart of the Ebonian worlds. Hallan Gents stood before this gathered storm and spoke his mandate. No quarter for the damned, no mercy for the willing, no tolerance for those who had bent the knee to alien or demon. The Ebonian subsector was to be purged, its crimes washed away in blood and fire. Those whose souls could be redeemed would be numbered in individual souls, not nations. The rest would feed the pyres. Different commanders heard different things in his pronouncement. The guard generals, used to throwing away men by the million, but at least pretending that some might be saved, spoke in private of surgical strikes, of decapitating, heretic leadership, and reimposing imperial rule once the worst of the rot had been cut away. The Sororitas' canonical documents spoke of testing the faith of populations, of trial by flame and fervor. The subjugators heard only that a cluster of worlds had been declared guilty. Within the strategium of their battle barge, beneath the glow of tactical hololiths showing the Ebonian system, the subjugators' captains studied Gents's writ with unblinking helm lenses. They read the phrases declaring the subsector beyond redemption and took them at face value. To their gene-wrought minds, there was no meaningful distinction between the heretic with a demon in his blood and the farmer who had kept his head down while witch fires lit the sky. Both had failed. Both had tolerated the intolerable. And both, in this moment, were obstacles between the Imperium and the quieting of this region. The subjugator's Lord Captain traced the lines of the writ with a gauntleted finger and immediately began to allocate ammunition. The first Ebonian world to feel the Crusade's teeth was a hive choke point that had long dominated the subsector's trade routes. Its spires reached into the poisoned clouds like rusted needles, its population counted in unsteady billions. Cults infested it from sump to spire. Traitor Guard regiments, once loyal line troops, now manned the great curtain walls around its hive clusters, supported by artillery pieces aimed as much inward as outward. As the Imperial Armada made its final translations into the system, vox chatter crackled between the commanders. The Red Hunters requested permission for precision decapitation strikes, proposing a series of teleport assaults onto key bastions and vox towers to sever heretic command and control. The war-bearers advocated a carefully measured orbital campaign to break the enemy's outer defenses before committing irreplaceable Astartes to the hell below. The subjugators simply requested target coordinates for the primary hive infrastructure. When the bombardment began, it was not the traitor gun emplacements that died first. From the armored flanks of the subjugators' battle barge, from their attendant strike cruisers and escorted monitors, the bombardment fell like the wrath of an angry god. Macro shells the size of hab blocks plunged through the clouds in burning arcs. Where they struck, hive superstructures disintegrated. Entire spires folded in on themselves, collapsing floor upon floor, level upon level, in a cascade of metal and ferrocrete and screaming life. Civilian hab rings packed with refugees seeking shelter were torn apart in the opening minutes of the war. Transports loaded with the lucky few who had secured passage off-world were swatted from the sky by over-ranging fire that treated all things flying as hostile. Traffic control towers were shredded, their vox arrays torn into twisted wreckage. The traitor artillery batteries died as well, buried under the same avalanches. But to the subjugators, that was a secondary benefit. Their intention was simple. They would deny the heretics their manpower, not by carefully isolating combatants from civilians, but by annihilating both in the same firestorms. A foe cannot raise new regiments from a population reduced to ash. On the ruined bones of those hives, the true work began. Company by company, the subjugators made planetfall. Drop pods howled through the thickened air, hulls shuddering as they rode plasma trails down into streets already choked with dust and smoke. Thunderhawks followed, belly bays packed with tanks and armored personnel carriers bearing the chapter's colors. They landed where their Auspex readings showed the greatest density of life, not caring whether those figures represented enemy formations or panicked mobs. Ramp doors slammed down. Engines roared. The advance began. Armored spearheads drove into the shattered hive districts in blunt, direct thrusts, their treads grinding over rubble and bodies alike. The first ranks of unfortunates in their path were not traitor soldiery, but civilians, men clutching their families, workers still in stained overalls, refugees clustered around makeshift shrines, screaming prayers to any power that would listen. The subjugators did not deviate. Bolter fire tore lanes through the crowds, explosive shells punching bodies apart in panicked waves. People broke and ran, only to find themselves herded by collapsing architecture and oncoming armor into killing grounds where there was no cover and no mercy. Tracks rolled over those who fell, crushing bone and steel with equal indifference. Blood, flesh, and powdered masonry clotted around road wheels and sprockets as the subjugators ground their way toward their true objectives. Ahead, traitor command bunkers and cult strongpoints spat lasfire and heavy shell. Icons of warped gods flapped from their battered walls. Dark banners waved over cratered plazas, where heretic officers tried to rally what remained of their troops in the face of the oncoming Astartes. The subjugators hit them like an avalanche of ceramite and fire. Under that iron advance, there was little room for subtlety. Flamer squads saturated choke points indiscriminately, their liquid promethium painting walls, barricades and bodies in burning sheets. Devastator squads took up positions in half-collapsed hab levels and raked both enemy lines and fleeing masses with high-caliber fire, their target selectors set to designate any heat signature not bearing Imperial transponder codes as hostile. Not everyone in the crusade approved. Guard commanders watching the feeds from orbit flinched as they saw armored columns vanish under their own side's artillery strikes, called down dangerously close by subjugator forward observers who prioritized immediate annihilation of fortified positions over the survival of guard regiments or refugee columns caught in the blast. Radius. Sororitas canonesses in their own command sanctums sent vox missives protesting the scale of collateral execution, suggesting that whole congregations might yet be brought back into the Emperor's light. They were answered by cold vox traffic from the subjugators' Lord Captain. "The Inquisitor has pronounced this world guilty," came the translated burst, shorn of all ornament. "A cleansed world does not rebel." To them, the matter was closed. The Ebonian Crusade ground on for years. It is called a 10-year war in the ledgers, but that number is meaningless. Time blurred under constant deployment. World after world fell under the storm. On one agri-sphere, the subjugators assisted in the seeding of virus bombs into the upper atmosphere, watching from orbit as the pathogen spread in an invisible curtain. Within hours, the fields lay quiet. The farmers and their families turned to blackened husks amid withered crops. Cyclonic torpedoes followed on other worlds, their dense casings punching deep into planetary crusts before releasing fury that cracked plates and boiled seas. Where viral fire and cyclonic fury were deemed insufficient, the old methods held sway. Mass executions were carried out in the shadow of shattered cathedrals, firing lines stretching for kilometers. Penal regiments and newly raised loyalty battalions were forced to serve as executioners, their lasguns spitting line after line of death into kneeling crowds, while subjugators watched for any sign of faltering resolve. Entire populations were weighed and found wanting. Tithes were recalculated not in terms of grain or ore, but in corpses. World by world, the Ebonian subsector was reduced. Populations counted once in teeming billions were rendered to scant millions, clinging to the edges of blasted coasts and cratered continents. Whole planets were scoured clean, their atmospheres left to howl over empty rock. In the end, there remained a single world that had not yet been brought to heal, a hive sphere whose catacomb depths had become a fortress for the most fanatical of the heretics. Here the cults had gone to ground, deeper even than the oldest manufactoria. Here traitor regiments and warp-touched warbands gathered for a final stand, intent on drawing out the crusade until the Inquisition grew weary and turned its gaze elsewhere. Harlan Gents proposed the simplest solution. The world would be broken from above. A massed cyclonic strike would end the resistance in moments, turning the hives into vitrified scars. The guard generals, ground down by years of attrition, nodded. The sororitas, their own losses heavy, clenched their fists and bowed their heads. Few among them had the will left to argue. The subjugators demurred. This world had become a symbol. It was the last refuge of those who had spit on imperial law and consorted with forbidden powers. They had not been broken by years of slaughter. They had not fled when others fled. To simply erase them in a single moment felt to the Sons of Dawn like an evasion of their duty. They argued, not for restraint, but for intimacy. Let the enemy be killed face to face, they said. Let them feel the Emperor's judgment at the end of a bolter, not in the impersonal heat of a star-killer warhead. Let the catacombs run red, so that no survivor can doubt what happens when mankind betrays its master. Inquisitor Gents, perhaps moved by some iron shard of doctrinal purity, agreed. The final assault on Abon's last refuge descended through poisoned skies in burning waves. Drop pods struck the upper hive like meteors, their impact craters vomiting forth armored shapes. Thunderhawks dove into cavern mouths blasted open by preparatory bombardment, disgorging squads into the lightless depths where the air hummed with warp energy and the reek of too many bodies crammed into too little space. In those tunnels, the scale of the war narrowed to corridors and chambers slick with condensation and blood. The enemy came in tides, traitor guardsmen shoulder to shoulder with frothing cultists, mutant abominations looming behind them, eyes burning with demonic light. They fought not for victory, but for spite, determined to make the Imperium pay dearly for every meter of shattered stone. The subjugators answered with methodical butchery. Bolters roared at ranges where muzzle flashes scorched armor, chains wards carved through flesh and bone until their teeth ran clogged and their engines shrieked in protest. Flamers turned choke points into ovens, the screams of those trapped within echoing down labyrinthine passageways. When groups of defenders broke and tried to throw down their weapons, hands raised, the subjugators did not halt. They had seen too many false submissions turn into detonating charges, too many pleading faces hide blades or demon whispers. They cut down the yielding alongside the defiant, armor splashed with blood, indistinguishable from those who had fought to their last breath. Deeper still, they found civilians packed into makeshift shrines and shelters, heads shaved, eyes wild, chanting borrowed litanies of repentance. Some wept at the sight of the Astartes, believing that salvation had come. Others could barely look at them, knowing what had already been done to their world. The subjugators did not sort them. Those who reached for the aquila carved into their own flesh were shot through the heart. Those who knelt and begged for testing were burned as potential carriers of corruption. In the words later recorded by one of their chaplains, true loyalty would have meant dying before the traitors arrived. Living to pray after welcoming heresy was merely another form of defiance. When finally the deepest sanctum was breached, when the last of the cult leaders were dragged from their altars and executed upon their own blasphemous symbols, there were no cheers. There was only the heavy rasp of Astarte's breath, the crackle of fires consuming the bodies, the distant rumble of collapsing hive strata as demolition charges finished what the crusade had begun. Inquisitor Harlan Gentz stood once again before his gathered commanders, his face gaunt with age and strain. He pronounced the Ebonian subsector cleansed. Its crimes, he declared, had been washed away in blood. The taint was purged. The stain remained only as a cautionary tale. The administratum saw something very different. Their reports, dry and bloodless, spoke of trade voids where once there had been bustling roots. Agri-worlds that had fed neighboring systems now lay as ash deserts, their soil poisoned by bombardment and virus residue. Hive planets once counted among the most populous in their region were reduced to hollow shells, their surviving inhabitants too few to meet even the lowest tithe grades. Whole columns of parchment were given over to proposals for recolonization efforts that would take generations, if they were ever approved at all. Calculations were made of the resources required to rebuild shattered manufactoria, to repopulate gutted cities, to scrape new life from stone. Most of those proposals were quietly shelved. There were other wars that needed those men and that metal. Among the common folk of neighboring sectors, the tales spread in a different form. They spoke of Astartes, who descended like executioners, whose arrival meant not salvation, but the possibility that a world would be judged wanting and destroyed to the root. They gave the subjugators a new name in their muttered legends, a title that captured the essence of what had been done to the Ebonian worlds. The empty liberators. They would free a world from heresy and leave it empty. They would break the hold of the foe and leave nothing behind but ruins and ashes that still bore the Aquila. In the secure strategia of distant sector palaces, where lords militant and governors calculated their own odds of survival, the lesson was heard clearly. The subjugators were a weapon of last resort. They were loyal, they were effective, they were tireless, and calling for them meant accepting that victory might look very much like extinction. The technetium belt was never meant to matter. It was a scatter of rock and ice around a dull star, a girdle of asteroids threaded with tunnel mines and hollowed habitats. Its populations a thin smear of laborers, and their overseers eking out quotas of rare metals for distant forge worlds. It had no great cathedrals to impress visiting cardinals, no parade grounds for honor regiments, no proud history inscribed on the walls of strategia. When the war came, it came quietly. It began with a sick note in the long-range augers. A bulk ore hauler translated from the warp on an impossible trajectory, bleeding drive plasma, its vox channels choked with static and wet, animal noises that no one wanted to transcribe. Patrol craft approached and found the hauler's hull scored with strange growths, metallic tumors budding from adamantine. Boarding parties in sealed armor stepped across to investigate and never reported back. Then other ships began to go silent. Astropathic choirs caught echoes of madness in the region, brief spikes of psychic pain that made even hardened, sanctioned psychers bleed from eyes and ears. Vox recordings from some of the outer habitats reached the wider Imperium. Low-quality picked, showing workers with their flesh turned almost translucent. Eyes clouded, bones warped into new geometries beneath the skin. Men and women peeled open like cocoons, and things that were not quite human crawled out of them, dragging themselves along corridor walls that pulsed in time with some shared heartbeat. The first reports called it a mutagenic plague. Later analysis named the culprit more precisely, Selkin. It was a viral Xenos breed, an infection that did not merely kill, but repurposed. It entered the human body through lungs or wounds, or the simple brush of skin. It burrowed into cells and rewrote them, strand by strand, turning muscle and bone into scaffolding for a new shape. Those who succumbed did not die in any conventional sense. They were devoured from the inside out, their bodies harvested as raw material for the construction of a new alien organism. The Technetium Belt became a hatchery. Habitats that had once housed mining clans and their overseers became growth chambers lined with moist, fibrous tissue. Ventilation shafts choked with slime. Air recyclers turfed out spores instead of oxygen. In some places, the very rock of the asteroids began to change, veins of ore swelling like diseased organs. The infection was not content to reside in flesh. It wanted everything. Containment was ordered. Fire was promised. Among the first Astartes to answer that summons were the Subjugators. They came with a battle barge and its attendant strike cruisers, their prows still scarred by campaigns near the Eye of Terror, their holds heavy, with armored vehicles and the cold determination of Sons of Dawn. The war that followed was no glorious planetary assault. There were no banners marching across open plains, no great siege lines around continent-spanning hives. The Technetium campaign was fought in the dark. Void battles flared among the asteroids as infected oreships and tug convoys threw themselves at the Imperial vessels, their decks swarming with half-formed Xenos that had once been crew. Subjugator gunners turned these wrecks into expanding clouds of shrapnel and ichor, but every vessel was a risk. Every fragment of contaminated hull that slipped past the blockade was a future outbreak, so they took the war into the rock. Boarding actions became the rhythm of the campaign. Thunderhawks threaded fields of tumbling stone, seeking approach vectors to habitats that still showed life signs. Boarding torpedoes were fired into spinning shadows, augurs seeking the faintest echo of human voices beneath the alien static. Within the tunnels, the sons of Xenax fought in claustrophobic slaughter. They advanced in full, sealed plate, auto-senses cycling through spectra to pierce the gloom. The air was thick with spores, their armor registering constant impacts of microscopic threats against their ceramicized shells. Stone corridors buckled and swelled around them, pustule growths bursting underfoot, releasing sprays of corrosive gel that hissed and smoked where it struck plate. They burned everything in their path. Flamers washed down galleries, their yellow tongues turning alien tissue to char and vapor. Bolt shells ripped through grotesque shapes that might once have been miners, now stretched and warped into many-limbed forms. Jaws distended around clusters of feeding tendrils. In some places, the enemy came in swarms of fleshy nodes that rolled and pulsed, extruding crude limbs as they tried to drag themselves toward the Astartes, drawn by some hive impulse. The Subjugators killed them, with the focused efficiency of those who had seen worse in the shadow of the eye. But efficiency was not immunity. The Third Company was the blade point of the campaign. Again and again, they were the first to breach a contaminated structure, the first to carve a path through the mutating dark. It was inevitable that sooner or later, some crack would appear in even their armor. It happened on a nameless rock that the campaign ledgers would later designate only as Node 16. The company's lead squads fought through an umbilical corridor into a central chamber large enough to dock a light freighter. The walls pulsed with embedded sacs that throbbed in time with a sound too low for human hearing. In the center of the chamber hung a mass of flesh and bone that might once have been a reactor, now transformed into a living organ, tendrils plugged into every conduit. Things like oversized spores dangled from its underside, dripping clear fluid. The Subjugators opened fire. Bolter. Shells chewed into warty surfaces. Flamers roared. The central mass convulsed and split. From within poured sleets of fluid, a rain of microscopic death. Warning runes shrieked inside helmets as armor seals registered impact after impact. Filters screamed under the load. For most, it was enough. But nothing is perfect. A micro-fracture in a wrist joint, a misaligned seal at a gorget, a flensed patch of plate where a previous battle had scored too deep, and the virus found purchase. They did not know at once. Infections incubated silently. The third company continued its brutal work, clearing node after node, burning out cell-kin growths wherever they found them. Only later, aboard the battle barge, did the first symptoms show. It began with fatigue jokes in the apothecarian, a veteran complaining that even after extended rest cycles, his limbs felt heavy, his armor too tight. A brother beside him laughed and said he was growing fat on campaign rations. The apothecary scanned them, both, and frowned at faint anomalies in their gene-coded readouts. By the time the alarms went up, it was already too late. Around 20 battle brothers of the third company began to change. Their transhuman frames fought the infection longer than any mortals could have, but the virus was tireless. Tiny shifts in cell walls became gross morphologies. Bones thickened, then twisted. Space Marine physiology, designed to adapt and endure, gave the cell-kin ample material to work with. Flesh sloughed and flowed beneath the skin, joints reversed, extra limbs budded from shoulders and spines, mouths sealed shut, while new feeding orifices tore open along flanks and throats. Armor that had been a second skin suddenly became a prison, plates creaking and splitting as the things inside them pushed outward. The apothecaries acted without hesitation. Those whose infections were confined, whose changes could be cut away, were hauled bodily to operating slabs. Here blades and saws worked, with brutal speed, slicing out corrupted tissue, amputating budding limbs, cauterizing and sealing in a haze of burnt meat and medica smoke. Some survived the butcheries, their bodies purged at horrific cost, left with scars that would never fully heal. Others died on the tables, their last breaths forced from lungs drowning in their own liquefied organs. Then there were the ones who went beyond saving, the 20. They erupted in the holding decks and chapels, in their sleep alcoves and training cages. Ceramite cracked as burgeoning Xenos forms tore free. What crawled from the fragments were nightmares, towering, many-jointed shapes with flashes of familiar subjugator heraldry still clinging to patches of armor welded into their new flesh. Their eyes, where they still possessed anything that might be called such, burned with a dull, alien light. Whatever humanity had remained was drowned under the hive will. They killed as they fled. Servitors were ripped apart, their metal, limbs yanked free like insect wings. Human serfs were simply trampled or crushed against bulkheads. A handful of battle brothers who tried to tackle their former comrades were smashed aside, knocked unconscious, or worse, by inhuman strength. The escaped 20 fought their way to the launch bays. In the confusion of alarms and automatic systems, trying to seal compromised compartments, they tore open the clamps on a waiting courier vessel. They spilled into it like a flood of meat and metal. The ship's machine spirit, maddened by conflicting commands, obeyed the loudest voice. It cast off and hurled itself into the void. Gun decks tracked it, but each deck crew chief hesitated for a fatal heartbeat at the sight of the subjugator's own colors still splashed across the hull. By the time orders clarified, the courier had fired its drives and plunged for the warp translation limits. The Cellkin had just acquired 20 Astartes-grade alpha strains and a ship to carry them. Elsewhere, the subjugators watched the courier vanish into the immaterium, a new shame. On Xinax, when news reached the fortress monastery, it hit like a physical blow. For a chapter that defined itself by its refusal to compromise, the idea that their own gene-kin now carried Xenos corruption into the galaxy was intolerable. Their purity had been breached, their vigilance had slipped, even for a heartbeat. The cost would be paid in unknown worlds and uncounted lives. They did what they always did with a stain. They cut deep. In the Technetium belt, their strategy hardened instantly. There would be no more attempts at fine containment, no more careful quarantines or selective purges of infected districts. The Third Company's losses had shown them the nature of this enemy. Anything that could be touched by Selkin might become Selkin. That was enough. Habitat masters, who reported even minor mutations among their crews, found their pleas for assistance answered with silence, then with the thunder of bombardment. Macro shells shattered entire asteroid stations, turning them into spinning clouds of debris and frozen viscera. Other habitats were boarded not for rescue, but for extermination. Every living thing inside was put to the torch. On one particularly stubborn node, guardsmen from attached regiments had held out for weeks in sealed armor, fighting a rearguard action against creeping walls of alien growth. When the subjugators finally arrived, the beleaguered humans cheered at the sight of the ochre plate. The cheering lasted until the first volley of Astartes' fire blew their command posts to pieces. The subjugators could not be certain that the guardsmen had not been compromised. That was enough. The entire mining population was slaughtered, and the facility's remains scoured with reactor fires until even the stone boiled. By the time the Technetium campaign ended, there were no survivors. The belt was declared contained because there was nothing left alive within it. Asteroids that had once hosted thriving, if harsh, communities were reduced to dead rock and twisted wreckage. Voxboys marked the region as interdicted. Patrol craft were instructed to obliterate any vessel that strayed too close, regardless of origin. The courier bearing the corrupted 20 did not reappear within any zone that Imperial augurs could monitor. Somewhere beyond the mapped routes of the Imperium, 20 once subjugators writhed and grew in the dark, their mutated forms seeding new hives in unknown systems. The chapter could not hunt what it could not find, but it could ensure that it never again hesitated when facing an infection. Many centuries later, that resolve was tested in the drowning light of Tirama Secundus. Tirama was an ocean world, its landmasses reduced to scattered archipelagos and knife-edged mountain ranges barely breaking the surface of a deep, cold sea. Its human population clung to shorelines and artificial platforms, hive towers rising from the waves like rusted spears. Their cities were built on the presumption that the ocean was an enemy to be held at bay by walls and pumps. They were wrong. The first signs were subtle. Fishing fleets failed to return. Deep-sea mining rigs dropped from the Voxnet. Coastal settlements reported tremors and strange lights in the abysses beyond their hab blocks. Then came the tides. The waters rose overnight, not in storm surges or natural tsunamis, but in deliberate pulsing waves that struck at inhabited coasts again and again. With them came shapes, glimpsed in the foam and spray, too large and too regular to be mere animals. Whole districts were pulled under, foundations collapsing as something beneath the seabed shifted and tore. Millions vanished. By the time the wider Imperium truly noticed, the human populations of Tirama Secundus had been shackled in a fashion more total than any chain. A xeno species had arisen from the depths, ancient, or newly spawned, no one knew. It had taken the drowned millions and reshaped them, not physically, but psychically. Through hooks in the soul, rather than in the flesh, it had bound them into a great communal mind. Those who walked the flooded streets and prayed in the half-drowned shrines were no longer entirely themselves. They moved in strange unison. Their eyes were glassy. Their voices echoed with harmonics that did not match their throats. In the abyssal trenches, the architects of this enslavement built feigned cities of cyclopean stone and living coral. Towers of bone-white material rose from the trench lips, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that played across the clouds. Great tentacular constructs wrapped around the foundations of human hive towers, dragging them slowly down into the lightless depths, their populations singing hymns in alien tongues as the water closed over them. The Ordo Xenos took notice. So did the Death Watch. Inquisitor Gerberman, a hard-eyed hunter of alien abominations, assembled a task force. Death Watch kill teams drawn from a dozen chapters descended on Tirama, their armor black as the space between stars, adorned with the silver of their oath to fight the Xenos. With them came the Subjugators, answering Gerberman's call with the same implacable readiness they showed any summons that promised extermination. The war was waged on a planetary scale, above and below the surface. From orbit, Imperial warships plotted the positions of the emerging oceanic Fane cities. Auspex sweeps traced energy patterns in the depths, mapping the pulsing hearts of the alien structures. The first strikes were surgical by the standards of such wars. Lance batteries burned down, stabbing shafts of coherent light into the seas, boiling water and stone alike. Torpedoes packed with depth charges plunged into the trenches, detonating with mountain-shattering force. Whole regions of ocean flashed to steam in moments, white pillars of vapor, climbing into the upper atmosphere, carrying with them fragments of things that had never seen the sky before. Tentacles the width of hab blocks thrashed in the boiling water, then fell limp, severed. Great, shell-plated shapes rolled to the surface belly up, their many eyes dull. On the coasts, Death Watch teams and Subjugator squads made landfall in armored assault barges, their tracks biting into sand and collapsed hab foundations. Together, they pushed into flooded hive basements, knee-deep in brine and human offal, hunting the nodal points where the psychic chains were anchored. They found horrors in the half-light. In one hive, entire levels had been converted into living shrines, the walls grown over with a thin, glistening film that pulsed like skin. Human bodies hung from the ceilings in rows, their spines plugged into the walls by tendrils of pale tissue. Their limbs twitched in unison, fingers tapping out unheard rhythms on the air. Their eyes stared, unblinking, at nothing. In another, the defenders faced not slavering beasts, but orderly ranks of ensnared citizens, men and women carrying standard pattern lasguns and fighting with perfect coordination. They moved like marionettes, sharing one puppeteer. When one fell, another stepped calmly into their place, firing with exactly the same cadence. Killing them was easy. Stopping them was harder. Every time a link in the chain was cut, the alien mind tightened its grip on those that remained. Shockwaves of psychic force rolled through the hives, making unshielded mortals bleed from their faces and ears. Even Astartes' autosenses flickered under the strain. In the depths of the Fane cities, the true bodies of the Xenos lurked, massive, many-limbed things anchored by tendrils into the bedrock, their own thoughts distributed among the millions of minds they rode. To break them required immense force. The Subjugators did not hesitate. They argued from the first for the heaviest possible measures. Orbital strikes were not to be constrained by the presence of enslaved humans. Shoreline cities that had become nodes of psychic control were to be treated as enemy constructs and erased. Refugee fleets that had taken to the seas to escape the flooding hives were, to their eyes, nothing more than drifting clusters of potential psychic relays. Inquisitor Gerberman, for all his own ruthlessness, hesitated. The Death Watch commanders counseled a more measured response. Some of the enslaved, they argued, might be freed. If the alien mind could be disrupted at its source, if the primary nodes could be destroyed, the psychic chains might snap and leave survivors who could be studied, perhaps even rescued. The Subjugators' captains listened to such talk and tasted technetium again. They remembered the 20 that had escaped them, their own brothers turned into carriers of corruption that would spread in darkness beyond their reach. They recalled the feeling of watching a compromised ship slide into the warp because they had allowed themselves a moment's doubt. They refused to repeat that mistake. In council aboard the command ship, a Subjugator's captain spoke over the skull helms of Death Watch veterans and the robed form of Gerberman. His voice was flat, without ornament. "These people are gone," he said. "Their souls are chained to the alien. If we leave one alive, we risk another technetium. If it can be infected, it can be executed." The phrase settled over the strategium like a sentence. Deathwatch representatives argued still, citing the need for specimens, for understanding. They spoke of the long war against the Xenos, of knowledge as a weapon. They wanted sample populations extracted, small pockets of enslaved humans, cut away from the greater mass, kept in stasis for later study. The subjugators did not compromise. Extraction operations that might have plucked tens of thousands from doomed coastal enclaves were cancelled with a single transmission. Assault barges that could have been used to ferry refugees to higher ground were instead loaded with fuel and munitions. Shorelines became kill zones. Storm by storm, fire by fire, the subjugators enacted their solution. They hit the coasts first. Cities that clung to cliffs and piers were already half drowned. Their remaining populations clustered on the highest platforms, watching the horizon with hollow eyes. When the Astartes came, many raised their hands in welcome, believing that the nightmare from the sea was about to be driven back. The first salvo of artillery corrected them. Siege guns emplaced on high ground opened fire on the flooded streets, their shells bursting amid crowds and alien constructs alike. The water ran red, then black. Buildings sheared away under the impacts, their lower levels already hollowed by the Xenos dragged into the sea in avalanches of steel and stone. Those who tried to flee up the slopes found their paths cut off by flame projectors, liquid, promethium pouring down like molten rain. Refugee fleets fared no better. Bloated barges and patched-together flotillas dotted the coastal waters, filled with those who had fled the first rises of the sea. They floated under skies streaked by the contrails of Imperial fighter craft, their decks covered in frantic, waving figures. Their vox pleas went unanswered, or were met with curt orders to shut down transmitters. Under the subjugators' direction, naval gun lines turned those waters into charnel pits. High explosive shells walked across the flotillas in deliberate patterns, turning vessels to splinters and bodies. In places where the Xenos had integrated their psychic web into the hulls of these ships, the explosions were accompanied by flares of unseen energy, the alien mind shrieking across the warp as another cluster of thralls died. In the deep trenches, the final blow was prepared. The Fane cities were vast, cyclopean things grown from a mixture of stone, coral, and flesh. Their towers speared up through strata of compressed bone, their foundations wrapped around the very tectonic plates. Destroying them would not be a matter of simple bombardment. It would require a degree of violence that might reshape the planet. Gerberman made his choice. From high orbit, under his authority, the fleet loaded cyclonic torpedoes. These were weapons of last resort, their warheads designed to penetrate deep into a planet's crust before releasing energies that could fault entire plates. On most worlds, their deployment would have been unthinkable. On Tyrama Secundus, where the bulk of the population was already drowned or enslaved, and the Xenos infection ran through every shore, they were deemed necessary. The subjugators were satisfied. The Death Watch were grim. No one was happy. Launch orders were given. Torpedoes fell in measured salvos, each one a spear of contained apocalypse. They plunged through cloud and vapor, punching into the ocean in thin lines of foam that betrayed nothing of the devastation to come. For long moments nothing happened. Then the world bucked. Sections of the sea rose in obscene bulges as shockwaves tore through the water. Whole basins lifted, then collapsed, sending walls of liquid thundering outward. In the trenches where the Fane cities slept, the torpedoes reached their trigger depths and opened. The explosions did not flash in the sky. They tore the world from within. Stone shattered. Fault lines that had lain dormant for aeons ripped open, releasing pent-up energies. The great alien structures that had wrapped themselves around the bedrock were crushed, torn, and vaporized in moments. The ocean above them boiled in immense columns, turning to steam that screamed into the upper atmosphere. Churning maelstroms formed where the surface collapsed into voids left by disintegrated substrata. On the coasts, mountains cracked. Cliffs sheared away and fell into roaring cauldrons of water and steam. Whole hive stacks toppled, their lower levels eroded by the cataclysms beneath. Those human thralls who had survived the earlier purges died in the ensuing quakes, buried under waves and rubble. In orbit, sensors recorded the dying convulsions of the Xeno's mind. Psychic shockwaves pulsed out through the immaterium as each Fane's city died, as each anchor point was shattered. For a brief, terrible moment, the screaming souls of millions of enslaved humans flared like candles in a hurricane, then went dark. When the seas finally settled, they did so over a changed world. Terama Secundus was not broken entirely. Its crust held, if only just. Its oceans were scarred with churning gyres, and new island chains formed from thrust-up strata. The Fane cities were gone, their architects annihilated. So too were the overwhelming majority of the world's inhabitants. In the aftermath, Gerberman recorded the campaign as a necessary act of xenocide. The Death Watch added a new species to their grim rolls, marked as extinct. The Subjugators tallied their ammunition expenditure and the casualties among their own, and found both acceptable. Within the fortress monastery on Xenax, the lessons of Technetium and Tirama were carved into the chapter's doctrine. There would always be new infections, new corruptions. The galaxy was a breeding ground for plagues of flesh and spirit. The Subjugators had seen what happened when they hesitated. 20 of their own had been lost to the Selkin, carrying contamination into the uncharted dark. Millions on Tirama had died, not because they were evil, but because they had been touched by alien will. A maxim emerged from these truths, spoken first in the training cages and apothecarian chambers, then formalized in the litanies taught to neophytes. If it can be infected, it can be executed. The phrase was not a comfort, it was a blade. From that point on, whenever mutation was reported, whenever warp taint was suspected, whenever a world whispered of plagues that altered the soul, the Subjugators' default response was annihilation. Quarantines were for those who believed in second chances. The Sons of Dawn's harshest heirs believed only in certainty. Better a dead world than another Technetium. Better an empty ocean than another Tirama. In the long roll of wars that followed, countless lives might have been saved by a gentler hand. Under the Subjugators, those lives were measured, found questionable, and burned. The Jericho Reach had been a wound in the Imperium long before the Xenos came to feed upon it. Once, in ages when the Imperium still believed it could expand without courting disaster, the Reach had been a proud region of compliant worlds and fortress systems, a string of bastions marking an outer cordon of mankind's domain. Then came warp storms and neglect. Trade routes shifted. Wars elsewhere drew away fleets and regiments. The long night crept in. Whole sectors were cut adrift, their worlds, left to face alien predations and internal rot alone. By the time the warp tides calmed enough for the High Lords to look outward again, the Jericho Reach was a half-remembered name attached to a cluster of flickering beacons and corrupted charts. The Achilles Crusade was their answer. It was an act of belated arrogance, a massive war of reconquest hurled into the Reach from the safety of better-defended space. Crusade fleets burned through the dark on pillars of plasma, bearing guard armies, titans, knights, and holy orders enough to drown 100 rebellions. The crusade was divided into salients, each one a spear, thrust along a particular axis of advance. Some faced fortified heretic empires. Others contended with entrenched Xenos realms that had grown fat in the Imperium's absence. Into this cauldron, the Subjugators sent a full company. It was a decision that raised quiet questions among those who tracked such things. The subjugators were sons of dawn affixed by duty to the regions around the Eye of Terror. They were Astartes' praises, jailers of the greatest warp breach in existence. To detach a full company from that vigil was no small thing. The lords of Xenax did it anyway. To them, the Jericho Reach was simply another breach in the wall, another place where the enemies of mankind had slipped through neglect and cowardice. The Achilles Crusade would either reimpose order or waste lives in futile gestures. If the former, then the subjugators would ensure that order was stamped in deep. If the latter, their presence would at least ensure that some enemies died in satisfactory numbers before the inevitable collapse. They did not go to save the Reach. They went to punish it. When they arrived, they found that the Reach had already attracted a new predator. Hive Fleet Behemoth had broken itself against Macraga, but the devouring hunger behind it had not died. Splinters of that will had gone questing through the void, tasting for new feeding grounds. One such tendril found the Jericho Reach and drove a living spear into its softest places. The Xenos, called Tyranids by frightened scholars and curses by everyone else, began to feed. This new aggregation of bioships and spores and breeding nodes was labeled Hive Fleet Dagon, another entry in the Imperium's growing catalogue of apocalyptic threats. Dagon's approach was methodical, inhuman, precise. It did not launch a single overwhelming assault as Behemoth had. It probed. Thin feelers of lesser organisms stole into isolated systems, testing the defenses. Small fleets settled over backwater worlds and stripped them of all life, then withdrew before Imperial responses could arrive in strength. Listening posts and outlying stations went dark, their last picked captures showing only writhing shadows and brief flashes of chitin. The Crusade command realized, too late, that Dagon was mapping them. Against that slow, strangling advance, the Achilles Crusade was forced to divert strength. Salients aimed at reconquering worlds from traitor regimes found themselves starved of ships as those vessels were pulled away to plug the holes torn in the Reach's flanks by the Hive Fleet. The Imperial war machine, already stretched by a dozen other wars, groaned as more resources were poured into a region that had never meant anything before. In this chaos, the subjugators' strength was fractured. Their company, originally intended as a hammer for shock assaults against human-held strongholds, was split. A demi-company was tasked with holding an outlying defense point on the edge of the Bekrin system, a place the Crusade planners grimly named the Grey Hell Front. Bekrin was not especially valuable in itself. It was a scarred world, its surface broken by ancient bombardments, its atmosphere thin and sour. What mattered was its position. It sat in the path of one of Dagon's exploratory tendrils, a stepping stone between the devouring front and more densely populated systems further coreward. If Bekrin fell quickly, if its void defenses were stripped away, there would be little to slow the hive ships from sinking their feeder tendrils into richer meat. The Grey Hell Monitor Station was the linchpin. It was a vast construct in high orbit, more gun than habitat. Its central spine was a mountain of plasteel and adamantine studded with macro batteries and lance arrays. Habitation rings coiled around its equator, mostly for crew and life support. Beneath them hung ammunition magazines large enough to resupply battle fleets. Void shield projectors jutted outward like thorns. The subjugators took possession of this behemoth with the same grim efficiency they brought to all such duties. They cleared out the previous garrison commanders, reassigned the station's mortal crew into neat hierarchies, and began cycling demi-company squads through continuous battle drills. They knew Dagon would come. They had read the augur reports, seen the distant movements of bioships along the Reach's bleeding edge. They had watched hololiths showing worlds devoured, their atmospheres stripped, their continents chewed down to bedrock. They intended to make the Grey Hell Front a place where the Hive Fleet would bleed. When the Tyranids arrived, they did so with the cold grandeur of a storm front. First came the vanguard spores, tiny things by the standards of the void, small enough to be missed by coarse auger sweeps. They dropped in at odd angles, on trajectories that would bring them in close to the station's shield perimeter before they could be targeted. Defense crews, drilled now under subjugator oversight, picked up some and blasted them to moats with point defense fire. Others slipped through, burning up in the upper atmosphere of Bekrin or splattering across dead rock. Then the real fleet arrived. Hive ships slid out of the dark, immense bloated forms trailing veils of smaller organisms. They came in layers. The first wave was composed of beasts that spat mycetic spores by the million interplanetary gravity wells, each spore bearing a seed of future armies. The next layer consisted of ravenous feeder vessels with maws that could close around an entire cruiser and strip it to composite elements in minutes. Behind them, deeper in the formation, lurked the shadowed shapes that housed synapse creatures, nodal organisms that emanated the controlling will of the swarm. The monitor station's guns woke like a volcano. Macro cannon shells howled into the void, their casings glowing as they tore across kilometers of nothingness before slamming into carapace and chitin. Great chunks of biohull were ripped away, spinning out into the dark amid clouds of freezing ichor and shredded flesh. Lance beams stabbed forward in white lines, boring through softer organisms in neat, cauterized tunnels. For a time, it seemed as though the grey hell front might simply drown the first tendril of Dagon in fire. But the Tyranids were not a conventional foe. They did not care about casualties. Every dead organism was raw material to be reclaimed, every ruined beast a datum in an endless calculus. They adjusted. Hive ships altered their approach vectors, closing with the station from multiple angles, so that its batteries could not bring full broadsides to bear on all of them at once. Waves of smaller spore ships, little more than living shells packed with lesser beasts, interposed themselves between the main fleet and the monitor, absorbing fire meant for more valuable targets. Some detonated in proximity to the shields, splattering them with corrosive fluids and spore clouds that began to erode the projected fields. Inside the station, warning runes flared. Void shield capacitors howled as they were driven beyond their optimal tolerances. Heat bled through armor plating as guns cycled without rest, barrels glowing dull red, then white, then edging toward transparency with each discharge. The subjugators refused any suggestion that the guns might be throttled or that there might be tactical withdrawals of certain decks to conserve power. Their orders were simple. The monitor station would stand and fire until it either broke the swarm or died. Where other chapters might have considered ordered retreats, calculated fallbacks to secondary positions, the Sons of Xenax chose the stand-up brawl. They had fought Chaos fleets near the Eye of Terror, had held against traitor armadas, until both sides were reduced to drifting wreckage. There was no instinct in them for yielding ground. They identified the largest synapse signatures in the incoming swarm and committed everything to killing those nodal organisms. Lance batteries were retasked mid-volley to carve through the screens and strike at the shadowed cores. Boarding torpedoes were packed with melter warheads and launched directly into the maws of particularly dangerous beasts. When one of the greater bioships died, torn, open from within by detonations, or neatly cut in half by concentrated fire, the surrounding lesser craft spasmed and thrashed, their cohesion faltering. Each such death cost ammunition and time that could have been spent thinning more numerous lesser organism clouds. The subjugators accepted that cost. They did not care about the attrition curve, only about whether they could hurt the swarm's mind. Their stubbornness bought Bekrin time. It also drew the Tyranids' attention. As the battle ground on, as thousands of spore ships died in ragged shells around the station, the Hive fleet altered its approach again. It began to treat Greyhell not as an impediment to be eroded, but as a meal to be taken. Spore clusters larger than city blocks launched from the bellies of the nearest Hive ships, their surfaces studded with claws and living drills. They tumbled in slow arcs toward the monitor, adjusting their trajectories with bloody jets from ventral sacs. Macro cannon fire shattered. Some, detonating them into showers of chitin and ichor, but a few reached the void shields and pushed through, their own field disrupting organs burning out in the process. They hit the station like meteors. Armor buckled, hull plates bent inward, then ruptured. Pressure alarms screamed as the void punched in, drawing atmosphere and unfortunate crew into the dark. In the wake of those breaches came the swarm. They poured from the craters in tides, gaunts with scything claws and snapping maws, warrior organisms lugging biocannons that spat beetles the size of fists, serpentine horrors that twisted along corridors and clung to ceilings. Behind them, moving with unhurried predatory grace, came a larger shadow, a broodlord. It was a towering thing, a walking engine of predatory instinct. Its frame was all knotted muscle and armored plates, its limbs ending in sets of claws that could shear through ceramite like parchment. Rows of needle teeth filled its jaws. Its eyes burned with a cold emerald light, alive with the guiding consciousness of the swarm. It moved through the ruptured decks of the monitor like a machete through overgrown jungle, cutting a path for the lesser organisms. Where resistance stiffened, where defenders rallied, the broodlord went in person and tore that knot of resistance apart, sending a psychic shock through its followers that drove them into even greater frenzies. The subjugators met it in the corridors. They had been waiting for such a thing since the first spores struck. Firefights on the outer decks had been brutal enough, Astartes and mortal armsmen alike dying under waves of chitin and teeth. But the Tyranids were not content with the periphery. They wanted the reactor core, the magazines, the station's heart. Squads in full battle plate formed kill pockets in junctions and choke points, their bolters drinking deeply of the enemy. Grenades bounced down corridors and detonated, turning tunnels into temporary meat grinders. Flamers turned air and flesh to burning fog. The air grew thick with smoke and the reek of alien ichor. Floors were slick with chitin shards and minced flesh. There came a point where every step pushed through a layer of organic slurry, the crunch of broken exoskeleton mixed with the squelch of liquefied organs. Subjugators fell. Even their ceramite plate and transhuman resilience could not stand forever against endless claws and acid sprays. Here a marine went down under sheer weight of numbers, his armor disappearing under a writhing carpet of gaunts that chewed through joints and lenses until his death cries were lost. There another was impaled by a warrior's lance like talons, hauled bodily from the ground and torn in half. Apothecaries tried to reach the fallen when they could, carving gene seed from ruined chests in frantic motions before the bodies were dragged away or dissolved. Often there was no time. Tyranids poured over the dead as eagerly as the living, shoveling up Astartes' flesh to be spat into reclamation beasts that would carry the precious biomass back to the swarm. Every lost organ, every unrecovered progenoid was another blow to the chapter's future. None of that mattered in the moment when the broodlord came. It crashed through a blast door, already half torn from its hinges, clearing the remaining metal with a single sweep of its claws. Behind it, the corridor walls were painted in streaks of dark ichor and human blood. Ahead of it, a single subjugator squad stood in a cross junction, their armor stained, their bolters low on ammunition. The creature threw back its head and hissed, a sound thick with promise of death. The sergeant, his helm scarred, half his left pauldron chewed away, stepped forward. They met in a blur of motion. Claws the length of swords slammed down. The sergeant took the first blow on his raised chainsword, the whining teeth shrieking as they skittered across alien armor and shattered under the force. The weapon broke, shearing off at the hilt. The impact drove the Marine to one knee. Another blow came in, angling for his throat, and he twisted, letting it carve a gouge through his gorget instead of decapitating him outright. His brothers opened fire. bolters roaring in the confined space. Explosive shells detonated against the Broodlord's torso and limbs, blowing chunks of flesh away in sprays of viscera. The creature staggered, then surged forward again, its wounds already knitting in grotesque spasms of muscle. It hit the line like a living battering ram. One Marine went down with his chest crushed, ribcage collapsing inward under a hammer blow. Another had his arm severed at the elbow, his bolter spinning away in a trail of blood. The Broodlord reached out and snapped a third brother's head from his shoulders, helmet and all, with a casual twist, the spine tearing free in a wet arc that spattered the bulkhead. The sergeant roared Dawn's name and flung himself back into the fight. With no blade left, he used his hands. He seized one of the Broodlord's lower arms as it came in for another strike, straining every engineered muscle to hold it back. The creature dwarfed him, its mass a weight that even an Astartes might have struggled to fully counter. But he anchored himself with maglocks to the deck and leaned in, teeth bared. For a heartbeat, they wrestled, man and monster locked in a tableau of hate. Then his brothers gave him the only help that mattered. A pair of Marines stepped in on either side and fired point blank, their bolters pressed almost against the Broodlord's skull. Bolt shells punched through the thick carapace around its head, detonating inside. One eye burst in a stream of jelly, the other shattered. The back of the skull blew out in a blossom of bone and brain matter that coated the ceiling. The creature convulsed, limbs thrashing. One claw scythed down in a death spasm and took the sergeant's leg off at the mid-thigh, armor and flesh alike, parting in a spray of blood that joined the rest of the corridor's wet coat. He fell, bellowing, as the Broodlord collapsed atop him, twitching, its bulk pinning his lower body to the deck. The surviving brothers moved in with combat blades and crack charges. They hacked and blew until the twitching stopped, until the immense form lay limp, its ichor pooling and mixing with the sea of lesser beasts already slain. Later, when the battle had finally ebbed and the last of the tyrannid-boarding organisms had been purged from the Grey Hell station, that Broodlord's head was torn from its corpse and taken as a trophy. Its jaws were pried open and locked that way, teeth bared in eternal rage. It was mounted on a shield and fixed to a bulkhead aboard the strike cruiser Glorious Tyrant, a reminder that even the mightiest of the swarm's champions could die. The cost was carved into the chapter's rolls in blood. The demi-company that had taken station on Grey Hell was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Squads were broken, reduced to odd handfuls of survivors. Apothecaries lay among the dead, their own gene seed gone, their knowledge lost. Many fallen brothers could not be recovered at all, their bodies dragged into space through ruptured hulls or consumed by reclamation organisms that dissolved them into nutrient slurry before anyone could reach them. Bekrin was held. The Hive Fleet's tendril, battered and bloodied, recoiled from the savage resistance and went hunting for easier prey. For a time, the systems behind Bekrin's scarred orbit breathed easier. The Grey Hell monitor station remained in its orbit, but it was a wrecked thing. Whole sections were sealed off, open to vacuum, their exposed girders trailing frozen fragments of tyrannid matter. Void shields flickered uncertainly, their projectors damaged beyond reliable repair. Gun decks were pitted and warped from constant heat stress. The station's silhouette against the star was that of a wounded beast, bristling with broken spines. Crusade Command logged Bekrin as successfully defended. Reports spoke of a heroic stand that had stalled Hive Fleet Dagon's advance along that axis. Decorations were recommended. Liturgical celebrations were planned for the more pious regiments. In the private councils of admirals and generals, another note was added. The Subjugators were terrifyingly reliable. Give them a line to hold, and they would hold it until there were none of them left standing. Set them against a threat like the swarm, and they would spend their own blood and the lives of everyone around them with the same savage disregard until either the enemy broke or there was nothing left to fight with. but their victories always tasted the same. Where other chapters might have fought the swarm with layered retreats, drawing the enemy into traps, preserving strength for the long war, the Subjugators made every engagement a potential last stand. They saved Bekrin, but at a cost that another commander might have considered ruinous for so minor a world. They had a talent for ensuring that a world survived on a technicality, while leaving it and themselves so mauled that the distinction between victory and defeat became academic. Among those who had to allocate resources, who had to decide where to send irreplaceable Astartes and where to commit mere men, a pattern took shape. If a front needed to be held at all costs, if a breach could not be allowed under any circumstances, the sons of Xenax were a suitable answer. If there was any hope of a living world liberated rather than a dead one saved, other chapters were preferred. The Subjugators themselves saw none of this as problem or glory. To them, Bekrin was merely another line on their record of compliance. Hive Fleet Dagon had been given a lesson in the cost of biting at the Imperium's walls. That was all. Yet the Grey Hell front left its mark on them in more ways than one. The carnage in the corridors, the sight of their own gene seed devoured before their eyes, the knowledge that even an unremarkable world like Bekrin demanded such a tithe, all of it deepened the chapter's existing contempt for measured responses. They had always believed that half measures bred worse wars. Against the Tyranids, that belief ossified into doctrine. In the years that followed, when they were called back toward the Eye of Terror, when rumors spread of a new storm building around the Cadian Gate, officers who had fought beside them at Greyhell remembered. They remembered the Subjugators standing knee-deep in alien gore, firing until their guns ran dry, then clubbing the enemy with the empty weapons. They remembered broken armor and missing limbs, refused evacuation because the line was not yet quiet. They remembered the way the Sons of Dawn's harshest heirs had looked at the devouring tide and seen not despair, but opportunity. When Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade finally broke over Cadia, when the walls of that fortress world shook and cracks opened in the sky, the Subjugators' march into that maelstrom surprised no one. They had stood against the swarm at Bekrin and bled themselves white for a world that barely mattered. How much more ferociously would they bleed for the Cadian Gate, for Terra's last bulwark? How much of themselves would they spend to ensure that, if the Imperium fell, it did so over mountains of its enemies' corpses? The answer, as later generations would learn, was simple: all of it. The Damocles Gulf had always been a wound, even before the blue-skinned Xenos began to pour salve and poison into it in equal measure. It was a broad smear of difficult warp routes and unreliable charts, a gulf of ill-mapped stars lying between the eastern marches of the Imperium and regions left to languish under neglect. Into that emptiness, the Tau Empire cast its ambitions, bright and naive and utterly heretical. They spoke of unity and reason, of the so-called greater good, as if such ideas could exist without the Emperor's sanction. They built clean cities of white stone and glittering alloy, raised efficient hab blocks and smooth transitways, and told mankind that it could be part of something better than the rusted colossus of terror. For a time, the Imperium simply watched. Then settlements began to go quiet. Imperial commanders saw human regiments marching under alien banners, their gear refitted to Tau patterns. Administratum tithes failed to arrive, and the excuses that came instead stank of collusion. The Gulf stopped being an annoyance and became a threat. The Damocles Gulf Crusade was the response. It was not the largest crusade ever launched, but it was earnest. Imperial Guard armies translated into the region, their troop ships bulging with men and armor. Battle fleets reconfigured patrol patterns to mass void power wherever the Tau had dug in deepest. Other Astartes chapters took the lead in spearhead assaults, bringing the hammer of the Emperor down on those worlds, where alien icons had replaced the Aquila. The subjugators sent very little. On parchment, their contribution was negligible. One full squad of battle brothers with several of the chapter's armored vehicles, detached from wider commitments in the segmentum solar. In terms of raw numbers, they could not hope to match the weight of guard regiments or the presence of chapters whose entire battle companies were committed. In truth, the subjugators required very few boots to leave an indelible footprint. They were assigned to a ground campaign on a formally compliant world along the Gulf's rim. The Tau had come there as they always did, smiling behind their armor, promising technology and stability, and a place in their ordered little vision of reality. Local governors, tired of distant terror's demands, had greeted them as liberators. Human auxiliaries, Gewese in Taukant, now manned the walls of reconfigured hive bastions. Fire warriors in pristine armor patrolled streets where Arbites had once walked. When the crusade came, the world's skies filled with contrails and flame. Imperial Guard drop regiments burned in, their grav chutes blooming above the upper hive platforms. Armored spearheads rumbled down out of landing zones, battered into the ash wastes. Naval gun lines pounded the upper atmosphere, seeking to swat down sleek Tau aircraft and their hovering gunships. The subjugators came in on their own timetable. Thunderhawks bore them to ground in a storm of engine noise, hatches opening to disgorge ceramite-clad giants and the blunt shapes of their tanks. Their squad took the point of a column, built around a pair of siege tanks and several armored personnel carriers, their ochre hulls already stained by other wars. Auspex scans highlighted the enemy's positions ahead. Lines of fire warriors dug in along transitways, crisis, suits hovering above rooftops, hammerhead tanks lurking at junctions with railguns tracking for clean shots. To the sons of Xenax, it was not a battlefield, it was an operating theater. They did not see civilians sheltering in hab blocks, nor workers cowering in manufactoria. They saw structures that had permitted Xenos to root themselves in human soil. Every hab block under Tau control, every transit hub where water-caste diplomats had once preached the greater good, was now a tumor that had to be cut out. The armored column rolled forward. The fire warriors were precise. They had clean firing arcs and excellent fields of fire. Pulse rounds hammered into the advancing Imperial vehicles, washing their armor in flickers of blue light. Guard tanks behind the subjugators' spearhead took losses, hulls cracking under sustained volleys that chewed through less blessed plating. Infantry were turned to bright vapor where they were caught in the open. The subjugators did not slow. Their siege tanks answered with shells that turned firing lines into vaporized trenches. The first salvo simply erased a segment of the enemy. Fire warriors and their sandbagged positions alike fused into glassy slag. The second walked up the avenue and hit the hab blocks from which supporting fire was coming, entire floors erupting outward in gouts of pulverized masonry and meat. Transit routes became channels of gore. Refugees trying to push through the same roads were shredded under overpressure and shrapnel. Bodies turned into a carpet of ruin that the tanks simply rolled over. Treads carried away limbs and torsos, crushing them down into a slick mulch that spattered the undersides of the vehicles and filled the air with a hot copper stench. In one intersection, a cluster of human auxiliaries, wearing a blend of Imperial and Tau gear, raised white cloths as the subjugator column rumbled into view. They shouted in accented Gothic, voices breaking over the roar of engines, claiming coercion, pleading for mercy, promising to turn their weapons on their former masters. The squad sergeant watched them through his visor, reading armor tags and Auspex returns. They had once sworn to the Imperium and had then sworn to the alien. To him, that was all that mattered. He gave a single order. Heavy bolters spat from the bow mounts of the lead tank. The cluster of would-be defectors disintegrated, bodies torn apart in streams of explosive shells. Pieces of them pattered against nearby walls, sticking in clumps of torn flak cloth and skin. A cleansed world does not rebel. The campaign ground on. In the heart of a Tau-held city, built from repurposed Imperial structures and new alien additions, the Subjugators orchestrated a lesson that would etch itself into the memories of every guardsman who survived to tell the tale. The city had once been a hive, its spires reaching high, its lower levels choked with refuse and industry. Under Tau guidance, some of the filth had been scraped away, transit lines had been straightened, air quality had marginally improved. Fire warriors patrolled in neat squads, supported by hovering crisis suits that watched from above, their smooth armor gleaming. Hammerhead tanks glided through the avenues, their gravitic drives emitting a low hum, railguns traversing with mechanical precision. When Imperial forces pushed into the outer districts, they found themselves facing a foe that preferred precision to brute force. Crisis suits darted from rooftop to rooftop, dropping down through breach points to cut off flanking elements with surgical bursts of plasma. Hammerheads picked out guard command tanks and gutted them with single shots, leaving burning hulks to block the streets. Drone swarms disrupted Vox traffic, flooding channels with jamming signals and false orders. Where other Astartes might have mirrored that measured approach, fighting block by block, clearing each structure with care, the Subjugators had no interest in such work. They had prepared, even as the first waves of guardsmen died in carefully arranged kill zones. Under cover of artillery barrages, their tech marines had seeded the city's foundations with demolition charges, burying them deep in support columns and structural nodes. They had mapped the load-bearing lines of the hive-turned Tau metropolis and identified where a few precise cuts would bring the whole edifice down. When the time came, they bled the city. Crisis suits descended into a broad plaza, their pilots confident. They saw ragged guard units falling back, banners drooping, tanks smoking. They saw subjugator armor pulling away, its guns firing sporadically, as if withdrawing under pressure. Fire warriors advanced to occupy new firing positions on the edges of the square, their armor still fresh compared to the muddied and bloodied uniforms of the enemy. In their command uplink, smooth Tau icons overlaid the city, showing controlled districts in calming colors. Then those colors changed. The Subjugators sergeant, watching from a command post several streets away, gave a quiet bark into his Vox. In buried tunnels and forgotten maintenance shafts, charges the size of habstacks woke. The first detonation came as a distant thump, almost lost in the general roar of battle. The second was louder. Then the rest went off in a rolling cascade. Support pillars shattered. Underhive strata collapsed. The plaza bucked. Entire blocks around it sagged, then began to fall. Hab towers that had stood for centuries tilted in slow, majestic arcs, their upper levels breaking apart as they went. Showers of masonry and metal raining down. Transit routes cracked open, rail lines snapping like brittle bones. Fire warrior lines simply vanished as the street under them turned into a sinking wave, carrying them into the collapsing void. Crisis suits tried to rise on their thrusters, but falling debris smashed them from the sky. One battlesuit took a toppled hab block full in the chest, its shields flaring for a heartbeat before its torso imploded in a spray of armor fragments and liquefied pilot. A hammerhead, caught mid-glide, slid sideways into the gaping wound that used to be the plaza, its gravitic engines screaming in protest as they tried to compensate for the sudden change in geometry. It struck a falling transit car and both exploded, the combined wreckage tumbling into the darkness below. Those civilians who had clung to the Tau for safety had no more time to beg. Whole districts went with the collapse, packed hab blocks and transit hubs alike, shearing away and following the fire warriors into the yawning chasms. From the Subjugators' vantage point, the city center simply folded inward like a fist closing. The Tau Comnet, always a calm stream of data, spiked into chaos. Icons winked out en masse. Coordination faltered. In that confusion, the subjugators brought their armor back in, rolling over, shattered streets, firing straight into what remained of Tau positions before the alien commanders could re-establish order. Guard officers attached to the crusade watched the deployment logs with a rising sense of dread. On paper, the subjugators' method was brutally effective. A major enemy stronghold had been gutted in a single action. Tau casualties were beyond counting. Lines that might have taken months to win street by street had been erased in a day. The cost, as always, was everything in the way. Regiments that had been pushed forward in the initial assaults lost entire companies when the ground opened under them. Refugee convoys shepherded into supposedly safe districts vanished into dust and screams. Hab blocks that had only recently been brought under Imperial control were indistinguishable from those that had housed Tau sympathizers when the charges ripped through their foundations. Orders coming down from Crusade, command placing units alongside subjugator armor, came to be treated like veiled death sentences. Officers learned that any plea to hold artillery fire for the sake of friendly elements or evacuees would be met with silence or curt rejection. The sons of Xenax cared nothing for delicate cooperation. They had been given a mandate to break the hold of the alien. They would do so, even if that meant breaking the world under the Xenos' feet. When the Damocles front shifted, when the Crusade's priorities changed, and the subjugators were recalled to duties closer to the eye, their absence was noted with a mixture of relief and uneasy regret. They had been a blade that cut deep. They had also left wounds that would fester in the memories of those who had watched worlds reshaped by their methods. They did not rest long. In the Inca sector, far from the Gulf's blue fires, a different kind of war was eating at the Imperium's arteries. The sector was a nexus of trade routes, a web of void lanes connecting resource-rich frontier, systems to the forge worlds, and hive spheres that consumed their output. Merchant guilds, entrenched and jealous, had carved up those routes between them, each one holding charters that gave them near-feudal control over particular corridors of space. When profit is at stake, peace dies quickly. The Third Inter-Guild Wars began with sabotage and tariffs, and quickly escalated to raids and privateer actions. Guild-armed vessels clashed in the dark, their captains flying ostentatious colors even as they tried to blow one another's holds into vacuum. Convoys changed allegiances mid-voyage. Contracts were torn up and replaced with new agreements inked in quieter fonts. Into this chaos slipped the Eldar. They were pirates of a particular stripe, a corsair band that Imperial reports named the Void Dragons. Their sleek, needle-proud craft glided into the sector's lanes like sharks into a busy reef. They struck at both sides indiscriminately, plucking fat cargo ships and lightly armed escorts from the soup of traffic, spiriting away riches and captives and leaving only ruins. The guild fleets, already occupied with killing each other, found themselves outmatched by the Xenos' speed and foresight. Trade volumes crashed. Worlds that depended on regular shipments of food or fuel began to feel the pinch. The Inca sector's ruling councils, suddenly united by fear if not by love, petitioned for the Emperor's fist to fall. The subjugators answered. They sent not ground forces this time, but void hunters. A strike cruiser and its escorts translated into the sector under sealed orders, their hulls still marked by older campaigns. At their head was Captain Rahman, a veteran of numerous void engagements, his record a steady climb of victories and brutal decisions. Rahman was not interested in the guild's squabbles. To him, merchant families and their petty wars were background noise. The true enemy was the Xenos raider preying on Imperial shipping, he said, about his work with a single-minded focus that unsettled the guild admirals assigned to liaise with him. He made no effort to patrol in the conventional sense. Instead, he studied the patterns of void dragon attacks, their preferred targets, the timing of their strikes. He charted the half-seen currents of the sector's traffic, identifying choke points where the pirates would be tempted to strike. He then turned those places into killing grounds. In one case, he allowed a rumor to leak of a particularly rich convoy moving along a certain route, its hold swollen with archaeotech and rare minerals. The guild responsible shrieked at the risk. Rahman silenced them with a stare. The convoy sailed, its escorts painted in colors that made them appear weaker than they were. The Eldar came, as he knew they would. Their ships slid from the dark, elegant things of sweeping fins and shimmering energy fields. They moved with liquid grace, cutting across the convoy's course, lances flickering. The first few merchantmen died in moments, their hulls split open, their atmospheres flashing to crystals and mist. Then the subjugators revealed their teeth. Rahman's strike cruiser and its attached destroyers had been running silent in the void, their emissions masked, their profiles tucked into the shadows of local debris. At his signal, they powered up in perfect synchrony. Void shields flared into life. Launch bays snapped open. Torpedoes and attack craft streaked toward the Eldar ships from multiple vectors. The Void Dragons were not unused to ambushes. They flickered aside, their helmsmen threading impossible courses between incoming fire. But Rahman had anticipated their evasions. Minefields had been seeded in likely escape paths. Some were simple explosives. Others carried boarding torpedoes packed with Astartes. Elegant craft dodging torpedoes found themselves plunging into nets of detonations. Hulls buckled, their beautiful curves warped and torn. In one spectacular case, an Eldar cruiser, dancing clear of a spread of conventional warheads, flew straight through a cloud of disguised boarding pods. Hooks bit, armor clamps engaged. The pods opened, and subjugators in full plate poured onto the alien decks, bolters roaring, chains wards carving into unreal curves of wraithbone. The void became a butcher's shop. Rahman's ambushes did not distinguish between pirate vessels and the structures they attacked. On more than one occasion, Void Dragon craft were engaged, while in the act of raiding a trade station. Guild overseers begged Rahman to be cautious, to avoid damaging the platforms that represented their lifeblood. Rahman listened to their pleas, and then issued fire solutions that treated station and raiding fleet as a single combined target. Macro shells punched through docking arms and habitation rings, as readily as they smashed Eldar prows. Internal atmosphere vented in geysers from ruptured compartments. Void workers, artisans, merchants, and corsairs alike were hurled into space, their bodies tumbling together in slow, morbid dances. If a station survived such a battle, it did so maimed, its infrastructure crippled, its crew cut to a fraction. Often it was simpler in Rahman's eyes to finish the job. There were instances where the Void Dragons succeeded in disengaging, their ships slipping away into the dark on the edge of detection. On such occasions, Rahman showed no hesitation in ordering the immediate destruction of any station or way station that had hosted the battle. If Eldar had set foot there, if their feet had touched the decks, then the place was considered compromised. Better an empty hulk than a potential future nest. Tens of thousands died under those decisions. Void workers who had done nothing worse than sign on with the wrong guild, merchants whose only crime was optimism, families who had lived for generations aboard those stations. All were reduced to frozen corpses and drifting debris because Captain Rahman would not tolerate the possibility that Eldar might escape or leave hidden traps. Reports flowed back to Sector Command, thick with casualties and tonnage lost. They also carried another number, harder to quantify, but no less real: the drop in successful Eldar raids. The Void Dragons were bleeding. They were agile, vicious, and ancient, but the subjugators' relentless assaults and disregard for collateral had made the sector a harder hunting ground. The corsairs began to shift their operations, seeking weaker prey, looking for flanks to exploit. They ran into another wall, Rahman was not the only one drawn by the scent of Xeno's blood. From another vector, unanticipated by guild seers or even some Imperial trackers, came ships bearing the sigil of the Sons of Antaeus. The Sons were an odd chapter, rare and withdrawn, their warriors thickly built, infamous among those who knew of them for a resilience that bordered on the unnatural. They did not announce their presence. They simply appeared, their vessels cutting across the Void Dragon's routes, their own kill teams boarding Eldar craft and tearing them apart from within. Rahman encountered them first as ghost reports in the aftermath of battles he had not fought. Eldar wrecks, ruined in ways that matched no known pattern of his own, found adrift and empty. Then, finally, his augurs picked up the signatures of their ships on the edge of one of his traps. He did not hail them with florid welcomes. The first exchange between the Subjugators' captain and the Sons of Antaeus' representative was terse and to the point. Acknowledgement of purpose, brief coordination of targets, a mutual understanding that the Void Dragons would be crushed between them. Together, they turned raids into massacres. While Rahman's vessels drove the Eldar into predictable corridors of space with high-pressure attacks, the Sun's ships lurked where only a commander who thought like a predator would expect them. Eldar craft, veering away from subjugator fire, ran straight into plasma broadsides from previously silent guns. When Eldar captains tried to use their superior speed to slip past one Imperial formation, they found themselves bracketed by another. In boarding actions, Subjugators and Sons of Antaeus fought back to back, ceramite shoulders touching amid the elegant horror of Eldar corridors. Shuriken rounds sparked off thick armor. Power blades meant to cut through softer foes, met layered plates, and failed. In such close confines, the Subjugators' brutal directness and the Sun's uncanny endurance made for a grinding, unstoppable advance. For the Void Dragons, the Inca sector had gone from ripe hunting ground to trap. Their losses mounted. Eventually, even Eldar arrogance recognized that the cost outweighed the profit. Their presence in the sector's lanes diminished, then ceased. Trade, technically, was saved. The guilds rejoiced in their accounts. At first, the number of ships lost to piracy plummeted. Insurance ledgers adjusted their risk calculations. New contracts were drafted, promising a return to the days of reliable profits and steady flows. Then the truth settled over the balances. Where once there had been a lattice of way stations and trade platforms, there were now gaps, ugly holes in the web. Stations that had anchored whole corridors of commerce lay as twisted wreckage. Habitats that had supplied fuel, food and labor for passing convoys were gone, reduced to a handful of survivors clinging to crippled hulls. The cost of moving goods through the sector skyrocketed. Routes had to be lengthened to avoid debris fields and dead zones. Fresh construction projects were proposed to replace shattered platforms, but the workforce to build them had been vented into the stars or burned in Rahman's calculated purges. Worlds that depended on regular shipments felt the lag. Hive cities rationed, forge complexes slowed. The Inca sector staggered under an invisible wound, economy bleeding out over decades. In their private chambers, guild fathers muttered bitterly that the cure had nearly killed them. In public, they spoke of noble sacrifice, of the Emperor's angels protecting their livelihoods. Very few dared to voice their frustration where anyone important might hear. Across campaign records from Damocles and Inca both, a pattern that had always been latent in the subjugator's nature became unmistakable. Call them, and the enemy would die. Tau cities that had turned their faces away from terror would be pulled down, their alien banners buried in rubble. Eldar corsairs who had feasted on Imperial convoys would find their sleek craft torn and scattered. But the worlds and structures that housed those foes would suffer just as surely. Civilian hab blocks and trade stations, refugee convoys and way stations, all these were counted as acceptable losses if they lay between the sons of Xenax and their quarry. Commanders learned to weigh the choice with care. On one side of the scale sat the risk of losing a system entire, ceded to alien or heretic. On the other sat the certainty that, if the subjugators were summoned, that system might be held, but its people and infrastructure would be broken beyond easy repair. Win the war swiftly, at the price of decades of ruin. Delay, gamble, perhaps lose everything. In a galaxy that had less and less margin for doubt, more and more voices found themselves whispering the same grim answer. Send for Xenax. The eye of terror split wider, and the galaxy screamed. Warp storms that had seethed at the wound's edge for millennia flared into towering walls of unreality. The veil between real space and the Sea of Souls thinned and tore. Out of that howling madness came ships that were not merely vessels, but scars upon the notion of sanity. They sailed on tides of witchlight and corpse smoke, their hulls encrusted with the bones of conquered worlds, their banners daubed with the sigils of dark gods. At their head was Abaddon, the despoiler, war master of chaos. His will, a knife driven again and again at the heart of the Imperium. This time, the knife did not probe or test. This time, it sought to carve. The 13th Black Crusade fell upon the Cadian gate with the weight of a falling god. The void around Cadia became a graveyard in the making. Imperial battle fleets, anchored in their long, familiar orbits, found themselves engulfed by a storm of traitor warships and ancient demon-infested relics. Macro-cannon duels lit the dark with chains of detonations. Lance beams carved burning scars in the night. Titans strode across shattered moons. Asteroid fortresses were torn from their anchors and hurled as improvised projectiles. On the surface of Cadia and its attendant worlds, the ground convulsed under the impact of drop pods and burning hulks. Hordes of cultists boiled from hidden warrens, their long whispered prayers answered by the arrival of the legions they worshipped. Traitor guard regiments raised banners that had lain buried since the Horus heresy, lifting them high over trenches and bastions now turned against their former masters. Demon engines roared as they stalked into battle, their hulls a fusion of tortured metal and bound entities. It was a war measured in billions, and every one of those lives was already spent in the minds of those who had summoned it. The summons to the sons of Xenax came not as a plea, but as a statement of reality. Cadia stood between the Eye and Terror. If it fell, the direct route to the Segmentum Solar would be a corridor of fire, inviting the War Master's gaze toward the golden carcass of mankind's ruler. No one had to explain to the Subjugators what that meant. They had been raised for such equations. Within days of the first reports, the chapter's halls thundered with preparation. 2 battle barges, ancient and scarred, were roused from orbit, around Xenax and filled to their limits. Armories were emptied of siege tanks and dreadnoughts. Munitions magazines were stripped. First Company veterans, their suits of tactical dreadnought armor older than most worlds, marched alongside newly blooded line brothers from the battle companies. 3 companies were committed, an offering of gene-wrought steel and stubbornness. It was an enormous tithe for a chapter still young by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes, its gene stock not yet replenished from the wars it had already waged. The chapter master stood in the strategium, watching star charts flicker with the spread of the Black Crusade, and ordered it anyway. If the walls fell at Cadia, there would be no safe rear line to husband strength for. Xenax itself would eventually lie in the path of the storm. The subjugators vowed to send more, to muster every remaining resource as the war ground on. First would go the 3 companies. The rest would follow as soon as ships could be found and crews whipped into readiness. Xenax would empty itself like a vein opened with a sacrificial blade. The battle barges broke orbit and hurled themselves toward the Eye. They arrived to find a void that no longer resembled the charts. The Cadian Gate was a furnace. The world of Cadia burned under a storm of fire. Above it, in orbits crowded with wreckage and dueling fleets, hung stations and fortresses that had once formed a ring of steel around the planet. Some still fired in the Imperium's name, their macro-cannon throats choked, but not silent. Others had fallen. One such was a Ramillies-class star fort, a vast void-born bastion whose clustered towers and weapon spurs had guarded key transit routes through the gate for generations. Now its guns were turned against Cadia. The War Master's forces had taken it, pouring boarding parties across its flanks, suborning its crew with threats and gifts, corrupting its machine spirit with demonic whispers. Its void. Shields, once a bulwark against heretical assault, now sheltered heretic warships as they maneuvered behind its bulk. Its guns fired into the backs of Imperial vessels and raked the surface of Cadia with fire meant to scour away the last defiant bastions. The Star Fort could not be allowed to live. The third company of the Subjugators volunteered to cut its heart out. Their strike cruisers closed on the Ramillies under a hail of fire. They hugged the shadows of larger Imperial ships still engaged with traitor counterparts, using the chaos of the wider engagement as cover. Vox traffic screamed all around them, overlapping calls for aid, death cries, orders, counter-orders, prayers. Boarding torpedoes were launched in a storm. They punched through void shields that flickered under the onslaught of friendly and enemy weapons alike, their reinforced tips slamming into armored bulkheads. Explosive collars tore metal apart and opened them into the guts of the fortress. Subjugators in full battle plate poured into corridors lit by stuttering lumen strips and the muzzle flashes of defending traitors. The fighting was a nightmare of close confines and treachery. Traitor Guard, once loyal Cadian garrison troops, fought from barricades made of their former comrades' bodies. Cultists spilled from maintenance tunnels, knives and las pistols in hand, howling praises to gods whose names left a bitter taste even in the recycled air. Heretic Astartes stalked the wider decks, their twisted armor marked with sigils of long-fallen legions. The third company met them with rippling volleys and disciplined charges. Bolters thundered. Frag grenades cleared kill zones, clouds of shrapnel grinding flesh and flak apart. Chainswords whined, their teeth clogging with meat and snapping as they met corrupted ceramite. Subjugators advanced over piles of the dead, their own casualties dragged aside by serfs and servitors to be stripped of whatever could be saved. Still, the fortress was vast. For every corridor cleared, there were 10 more. For every gun deck silenced, another spat fire into the void. In the strategium at the Ramillies core, demonic energies crackled around once familiar consoles, twisting cogitator displays into leering faces. The chief corruptors stood there, robed and armored, chanting in distorted voices, binding the fortress tighter to the War Master's grip. The Subjugators' captain realized they could not secure the Star Fort in time. Even if they killed every traitor aboard, by the time they did, the battle outside would already have shifted. The fortress's guns would have done too much damage. Its presence as a possible ally would be meaningless among so much ruin. He made the only decision that aligned with his chapter's creed. If you cannot subjugate, annihilate. The third company shifted tactics. No longer did they aim to seize control nodes. They aimed to destroy them. Charges were placed on plasma relays and ammunition, magazines. Reactor control rooms that might have been recaptured were instead saturated with melter bombs and promethium. Tech Marines, faces set in stone, bypassed safeties and whispered harsh litanies as they forced machine spirits into overload. In the end, a handful of subjugators fought their way to the primary plasma reactor. It was a colossal heart of caged starfire, encased in armor and fields, its roar a constant bellow through the surrounding decks. Heretic tech adepts clung to its surfaces like parasites, feeding it their own blood as they intoned praises to powers that fed on ruin. The subjugators killed them all, tearing them from consoles and smashing their skulls under armored boots. Then, standing amid bodies and spilt oil, they set about breaking the seals. One by one, the failsafes were overridden. Warning klaxons rose to a shriek that drowned out even the reactor's rage. Across the starfort, systems flickered and died as power was sucked inward toward the core. The machine spirit, maddened, howled through every circuit. The subjugator's captain voxed the situation to the fleet. "The starfort will die," he said. "You will have a brief window. Use it." He did not request extraction. There was no time, and no sense in asking for what could not be granted. He turned to his remaining brothers, armor scorched, helms cracked, blood dried in thick layers across their plates. They nodded once, in wordless acknowledgement. When the reactor went, it went without finesse. The Rameles-class starfort, proud and stubborn, tore itself apart from the inside. The eruption of plasma punched through its armored flanks in fountains of incandescent matter, each one carving a tunnel through decks and compartments and out into the void. Sections broke away, spinning, wreathed in disintegrating fragments. The whole structure bulged and then fragmented, chunks of it hurled outward with lethal momentum. The shockwave rolled across the battle, slamming, into ships both loyal and traitor. Those closest, Chaos vessels sheltering in the fortress shadow, were flayed by debris and radiation, hulls peeled open like fruit skins. Others further out bucked as their shields absorbed the surge. For a moment, one of the War Master's captured fangs had been pulled. Almost the entire Third Company died in that act. A bare handful of brothers, those closest to teleport pattern locks or extraction points, were snatched away at the last moments, their molecules seized by teleport beams or their thunderhawks screaming from launch bays just ahead of the blossoming fire. They arrived on subjugator decks, burned, cracked, some missing limbs, all marked by the light of that dying star fort in the reflections of their lenses. Their gene seed was saved. The rest was lost with them. They were not the only casualties. The siege of Cadia devoured men and angels alike. The subjugators kept their own tallies, carved into adamantine slates in the Apothecarian and the chapter's war rolls. Gene seed harvested, gene seed lost. Brothers fallen, brothers recovered. Every campaign before Cadia had carried its own lines of names and numbers, but nothing on the scale that followed in the 13th Black Crusade. By the time the war at the gate reached its ugliest pitches, by the time the void was choked with wrecks, and the ground was a patchwork of overlapping kill zones, the subjugators had lost 168 of their battle brothers on Cadia and its attendant fronts. It was not the gross count alone that cut deep. It was how many of those progenoids could not be reclaimed. Demon engines dragged dead Astartes back into the warp, their corpses chained to brass altars. Warp-fired artillery turned fallen into vapor and psychic ash. In trench battles, bodies were buried under fresh earth and fresh dead before anyone could reach them. Whole squads vanished in zones that had been reality one moment and twisted madness the next. Apothecaries died under the same barrages as the men whose gene stock they were sworn to preserve. Their tools and knowledge were ground into the same mulch. Each progenoid that dissolved in a demon's maw or lay unrecovered under a tide of cultists was another thin slice carved from the chapter's future. The subjugators noted these losses with the same cold precision they used to calculate bombardment patterns, even as they stepped forward to fill the gaps with living flesh. At Casa Gallan, they discovered how much a fortress could eat. Casa Gallan was a city raised for war. Its walls were slabs of reinforced rockcrete, crowned with gun emplacements. Its bastions bristled with void shield projectors and anti-air batteries. Beneath its streets lay bunkers and tunnels enough to shelter millions. It had never known peace. It existed to fight. When the Black Crusade rolled over the Cadian Gate, Galan became a focus of that fury. Traitor legions hurled themselves against its defenses, backed by artillery batteries that spat shell after shell in overlapping arcs. Demon engines stalked the approaches, their claws tearing trenches into new shapes. The sky above the fortress city was a storm of contrails, burning wrecks, and constant cloud. The 1st and 5th companies of the Subjugators were thrown into that maelstrom alongside Cadian regiments and other Astartes. They took up positions in trench networks that extended for kilometers beyond the walls, every section a potential killing ground and grave. They fought in mud churned to a paste of soil and blood. Artillery duels raged day and night. Shells the size of hab blocks fell among the trenches, their detonations throwing men and angels alike into the air in pieces. Vox traffic was a constant roar of orders, screams, and static. The reek of propellant and turned earth never left. Subjugator squads manned forward positions, rearguard lines, and the void between. They led assaults to retake, lost bastions, bolters roaring as they charged through zeroed-in kill zones. They held ruinous strongpoints until their ammunition was gone and their armor dented and cracked, then fixed bayonets and fought on. Guard regiments, with their colorful markings and proud banners, marched into the same zones and were reduced to skeleton companies in hours. The sons of Xenax watched entire Cadian formations die around them, their bodies filling shell holes, their blood turning trenches into rivers. In one rearguard action, a single Subjugator squad and a scattering of guardsmen held a communication trench nearly a kilometer long against waves of traitor guardsmen and summoned demons. The trench walls became slick with sprayed gore, bodies piled waist deep. The squad rotated firing positions by stepping over the dead, boots slipping on organs and bone. When they finally pulled back, only 3 of the original 10 Astartes remained on their feet, their armor almost unrecognizable under clotted filth. The fortress held, but every meter of parapet was bought twice over, once with mortal blood, once with Astartes. The Tarn retreat would demand more. Tarn was not a fortress, not in the way of Casa Galan or Partox. It was a region of broken terrain and lesser casas, patches of urban sprawl and open ground where the line had always been flexible. When the Black Crusade's pressure peaked and the walls elsewhere buckled, Tarn became the site of one of the most savage withdrawals in the history of the Cadian campaigns. Imperial command ordered a coordinated pullback from exposed positions to more defensible lines. In theory, regiments would fall back in good order, leapfrogging one another under cover of artillery to new trenches and bastions. Reality was different. The enemy pressed too hard. Demon engines lunged into vulnerable sectors. Traitor air wings hammered retreat routes. Command and control, already strained, began to fracture. What was meant to be an orderly maneuver became a rout in slow motion. Tens of thousands of guardsmen ran. Subjugator squads did not. They formed hardpoints. At crossroads and bridgeheads, in broken hab blocks and half-ruined casa halls, they dug in and turned their bolters on the advancing tide. They called down ordnance on their own positions, trusting in their armor and in the brief respite that shock would buy for those behind them. In one infamous instance, a Subjugator's sergeant, overseeing a bridge crossing, watched the press of retreating guard regiments clog the span. Behind them, traitor armor clanked into view, guns traversing. Overhead, warp-tainted artillery burst in the air, raining down shards of burning stone and unnatural fire. The sergeant opened Vox to the artillery batteries that still answered his chapter's codes. "Drop the bridge," he ordered. "There are still our men on it," came the reply, thin and strained. "They are already dead," the sergeant said. "Only their corpses do not yet know it." Fire. The guns obeyed. Shells slammed into the support arches. The bridge shuddered, then broke, sections dropping into the ravine below. Men, tanks, and fleeing officers alike went with it, their screams cut off as stone and steel and bodies met the rocks and water beneath. On the far bank, the traitor armor ground to a halt, suddenly denied the easy path. The subjugators abandoned the position only when their ammunition ran dry. Then they fell back to the next pre-planned demolition point. They repeated this pattern again and again, turning blocks and bridges and entire districts into temporary bulwarks and then rubble. Each demolition crushed enemies and allies alike, but every delay brought a few breaths more for the overall line. Some called it necessary. Others, watching their regiments vanish in cascades of stone and dust, authorized by towering Astartes, called it butchery. As the war dragged on, as Casa Partox fell and the carefully delineated lines of zones and sectors collapsed into a tangled thicket of isolated pockets, even harsh necessity began to shatter under the strain. Command banquets and strategia that had once held the defense together were pulverized by orbital strikes. Vox relays died. Senior officers were killed, possessed, or simply lost amid the shifting front lines. The grand plan, such as it had ever existed, broke apart. The Subjugators' commanders reacted in the only way they knew. They chose ground and died upon it. Flexible defense requires communication, an understanding of where the line will bend and where it must not. In the chaos of the 13th Black Crusade's late stages, such understanding was a luxury. For the sons of Xenax, raised to see retreat as an admission of failure, the choice was simple. They dug in wherever they found themselves, refused further orders that seemed born of panic rather than calculation, and turned sectors of the Cadian front into self-contained redoubts. They anchored shattered remnants of guard regiments around their positions, formed fire lanes out of ruins and trenches out of mass graves. They did not yield meters, they buried them. The final act for many of them came at the edge of the Caducade Sea. By then, the war had become an apocalypse. Cadia's crust groaned under the constant hammering of orbital fire. The eye above had swelled, its baleful light painting the world in sickly hues. Demon worlds began to bleed into reality around the planet, their twisted landscapes overlapping with ruined hives and shattered casas. At the Caducade's coast, remnants gathered, a reduced company of subjugators. Their once full companies, worn down to ragged clusters of survivors, took up position along a line of shattered sea defenses and cliffside bastions. Around them coalesced fragments of Cadian regiments, battered auxilia, and the shattered survivors of once proud chapters and battle groups. Behind them, makeshift evacuation points had been set up. Transports, anything that could lift from the surface and survive the transit through the poisoned void, were loaded to breaking. Men clung to gantries and docking arms, begging and fighting for places on craft already dangerously over capacity. Heavy equipment was shoved into the surf or left smoldering on the beaches, too heavy or too valuable as a target to risk keeping. Ahead, across kilometers of broken terrain and churned sand, the enemy came. Cultist hordes poured over dunes and through the shells of seaside habs, their banners flapping, their throats raw with screamed praise. Traitor tanks clanked forward, guns traversing. Above, demons swooped on wings of tattered night, their laughter a knife along the nerves. The subjugators formed a line and swore to hold it until their last bolts were spent. They dug weapons into the rubble, set up overlapping fields of fire. They positioned what tanks remained in hull down slots behind dunes and broken seawalls. They sighted artillery pieces scavenged from wrecked positions and aimed them by eye. They had very little ammunition left and fewer reserves. They had no intention of surviving. The first waves broke on shells and shrapnel. Bolters spat into the mass, each explosive round tearing ragged holes through lines of advancing cultists. Heavy weapons turned on traitor armor, Lascanon beams lancing out to punch through corrupted plating. The seawall shook with every impact, showering the defenders with grit and pulverized stone. The enemy kept coming. Demon engines crashed against the defenses, their claws gouging trenches into the seawall, their mouths vomiting torrents of warp fire. In places they punched through, hurling Astartes and guardsmen aside with equal contempt. Subjugators met them in the breach points with crack grenades and power fists, climbing onto their backs, tearing at armor plates to jam explosives into raw muscle and cursed machinery. Each breach turned into a heap of wreckage and bodies. Each time, the line closed a little thinner, transports lifted behind them, engines roaring, hulls glowing with the heat of their overtaxed drives. Some were swatted from the sky by enemy fire, others vanished into the screaming void. A few, a precious few, made it through, carrying away those who might fight again elsewhere. The subjugators did not look back. Their world was the swell and crash of the enemy tide, the jam of bolter magazines, the weight of their own wounded as they propped one another up in the rubble. When ammunition finally ran out, they drew combat blades and went to meet the oncoming hordes with steel and fists. No flag was raised when they finally broke. No trumpet sounded. The caducade sea swallowed the blood of the living and the dead alike in the same indifferent salt. When the 13th Black Crusade ground to its exhausted end, when Cadia lay broken and the channel to Terra had been fought over until only wreckage remained to mark what had once been a world, the subjugators took stock. 3 companies had gone to the Cadian Gate. What came back to Xenax in the holds of battered ships and the few returning barges was a shadow. Veterans who had survived a dozen campaigns lay in stasis, missing limbs and organs that the chapter's diminished reserves could not easily replace. Line brothers, who had once made neat ranks in parade squares, now filled only scattered points in the fortress monastery's halls. The apothecary's vaults showed gene seed reserves hacked down to a fraction of what they had been, many progenoids logged as lost in warp taint or irretrievable battle zones. The chapter stood at a demographic cliff. One more war like Cadia's, one more decision to commit so much of their strength to a single inferno might end them. They did not soften. There was no change in their doctrine, no surge of newfound compassion for the lives of their own, much less those of the Imperium's teeming billions. If anything, Cadia hardened them further. They had spent their blood without restraint at the Cadian Gate, and still the galaxy burned. They had watched brothers vanish into demon maws, seen their gene stock dissolved in warp fire. And yet the Black Crusade had not been smashed, only delayed, deflected, turned aside at a cost that no sane civilization would willingly pay. The sons of Xenax drew the inevitable conclusion. Worlds were ammunition, enemies were targets. Their own bloodline was merely a resource to be invested where it would hurt the foe most. If their chapter one day ceased to exist because they had thrown every last battle brother into a breach that had to be held, then they would have fulfilled their purpose with a perfection that could not be improved upon. They walked the halls of their fortress monastery, past empty racks and sealed vaults, and felt no regret. Only a fire that had burned hotter at Cadia's walls and now would never truly cool. In a galaxy where victory all too often meant a dead world that still flew the Aquila, where peace was only the silence that followed extermination. The subjugators were not an aberration. They were the Imperium's own logic, stripped of its hypocritical trappings, taken to its most destructive and honest extreme.